I'm 33 years old and I've been carrying this anger in my chest for 6 years now. 6 years of planning, waiting, getting stronger while everyone in my family thought I was still that same broke loser they could mock at every gathering. But here's the thing nobody understood about me back then, and nobody understands now. I don't forget. I don't forgive. And I definitely don't let people humiliate me without consequences. Let me back up because this needs context. I'm the middle child in a family that worships success above literally everything else. My older brother Derek graduated top of his class, went into investment banking, married some woman whose family owns half the commercial real estate in our city. My younger sister Skylar became a corporate lawyer by 26. And me? I was the art school dropout who couldn't hold down a retail job, living in a studio apartment that smelled like mildew, borrowing money from my parents every few months just to make rent. My father Eugene ran his own consulting business for 35 years. The man measured human worth in salary figures and job titles. My uncle Raphael was exactly the same, always talking about quarterly earnings and market share like it was the only language worth speaking. My aunt Edith married into money and never let anyone forget it. My mother Dahlia just went along with whatever my father said, nodding and smiling while he tore me apart at every family dinner. The worst part? I actually tried. I tried so hard to make them proud. I worked 3 part-time jobs at one point, barely sleeping, trying to save up enough to go back to school. But every time I saw them, all I heard was how Derek just got another promotion, how Skylar just made partner, how I was wasting my potential and embarrassing the family. My brother would literally laugh in my face when I mentioned job interviews. Skylar would make comments about how she couldn't imagine being 27 and still living like a college student. 6 years ago, things were at their absolute worst. I'd just been fired from a warehouse job because I called in sick too many times. I had the flu, but apparently that wasn't a good enough excuse. I was 2 months behind on rent. My car had been repossessed. I had about $400 to my name, and I was eating rice and canned beans for every meal. I asked my father for a loan, just $2,000 to catch up on rent and avoid eviction, and he said he'd think about it. 2 weeks later, he invited me to a family gathering at his house. Said we needed to discuss my situation. I actually felt hopeful driving there in my friend's car because mine was gone. I thought maybe, he was finally going to help me out, give me that loan. Let me get back on my feet. I showed up early. Nobody answered the door. I could hear voices and music coming from the backyard, so I walked around the side of the house. The gate was locked, but I could hear everything. They were all back there, my parents, Derek, Skylar, my aunt and uncle, some of their friends from the country club. And then I heard my father's voice rise above the others. He was giving a toast. I stood there by that fence and I listened to my father thank everyone for coming to celebrate his retirement. 35 years of building a successful business, he said. 35 years of creating a legacy. And then he said he was grateful to have 2 children who understood the value of hard work and excellence. 2 children. He went on about how proud he was of Derek's achievements in finance, how Skylar was already making a name for herself in law, how they represented everything he'd tried to instill in his kids about discipline and ambition. Then he paused and everyone got quiet and he said, unlike my pathetic excuse of a son who's probably hiding outside somewhere, too ashamed to show his face, the family parasite who can't even hold a minimum wage job, Derek started laughing immediately. That's when I pulled out my phone and started recording through a gap in the fence. My brother actually said, "That loser? He'll die alone in his filthy apartment begging for scraps." Everyone thought this was hilarious. My uncle said I was a walking failure, a waste of oxygen and DNA. My aunt said thank God my parents had one real son because I was just human garbage. Skylar added that I was 33 and still a loser living off handouts, and everyone applauded. They actually raised their glasses and toasted to my father's success and to Derek and Skylar, while basically celebrating the fact that I was worthless. My mother didn't say anything. She just stood there with her wine glass and smiled. I recorded 12 minutes of it, every word, every laugh. I saved that video in about 5 different places, and then I drove back to my apartment and I made myself a promise. I was going to turn my entire life around, and I was going to use every single bit of my success to make them regret what they said that day. For the next 6 years, I worked like I'd never worked before. I got a job doing data entry at a tech startup. It paid barely above minimum wage, but it had benefits, and the company was growing. I stayed late every night, taught myself coding on YouTube and free courses, made myself indispensable. When the startup got bought out by a bigger company, I leveraged my skills into a junior developer position, then a senior position, then a team lead role. I moved to a better apartment, then a house. I bought a car, paid cash. I invested money I'd saved. I built up a network of contacts in my industry. And through all of this, I maintained minimal contact with my family. I showed up to maybe 1, in every four family events, stayed for an hour maximum, barely spoke to anyone. They all assumed I was still struggling, still barely getting by. Derek would ask me how the job search was going with this smirk on his face. Skylar would offer to introduce me to people who were hiring for entry-level positions. I never corrected them. I let them think exactly what they wanted to think. 3 months ago, my father reached out. He said the family wanted to do a big reunion for his 70th birthday. Everyone would be there. He really hoped I could make it because family was important and they all wanted to see me. The message was so sweet and fake I could barely read it without laughing. I told him I'd try to make it, but I was really busy with work. He asked what I did for work now, and I just said tech stuff. Nothing special. He didn't push it. 2 months ago, Derek sent me a message on Instagram asking if I could loan him $5,000. Apparently, he'd made some bad investments and needed to cover some immediate expenses. I read that message probably 10 times. My brother, who'd mocked me for being broke, who'd laughed while our father called me a parasite, was asking me for money. I ignored it. A month ago, Skylar called me. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to let her stay in my place for a few weeks because she was having some issues with her apartment building and needed somewhere temporary. She'd heard I had my own place now. I asked her how she heard that, and she got vague. Said someone mentioned it. I told her my lease didn't allow long-term guests. She got annoyed and said she was family. Couldn't I help her out? I said I'd think about it and never called back. And then last week I got the official invitation to my father's 70th birthday party. Big event, at the same house where his retirement party happened 6 years ago. The invitation included a note from my mother saying how much they missed me and how proud they were of all their children. I RSVP'd yes immediately. Because here's what none of them know. I'm not just doing okay. I'm doing extremely well. The tech company I worked for went public 2 years ago, and my stock options made me wealthy enough that I could retire right now if I wanted to. I own my house outright. I have investments that generate more passive income than Derek makes in a year at his banking job. I've been sitting on this success, building it quietly, waiting for exactly the right moment, and watching them all scramble for money over the past few months while thinking I'm still their broke loser relative. That's been absolutely beautiful. I haven't told them what's coming. I haven't even hinted at it. As far as they know, I'm still that struggling failure they can look down on. They have no idea I have that recording from 6 years ago. They have no idea I've spent years planning exactly how I'm going to use it. The party is this Saturday. I've already prepared everything I need. And when I'm done, every single person who laughed that day is going to understand what it means to truly regret something. They wanted a family reunion. They're going to get one they'll never forget. Update 1. Okay, so the party was yesterday, and I need to get this all out because holy hell, some of you called it in the comments. Things escalated way faster than I expected, and now I'm dealing with about 15 different crises at once. First off, shout out to everyone who said I should dress well and show up looking successful. I wore a custom suit, drove my car that cost more than Derek's annual salary, and walked in like I owned the place. The look on my Aunt Edith's face when she saw me pull up was absolutely priceless. She actually did a double take and grabbed my uncle's arm. The party was in full swing when I arrived. Maybe 60 people there, mostly my parents' friends from their social circle, some extended family I barely knew, and of course the core group, Derek and his wife Nova, Skylar and her boyfriend Oscar, my aunt and uncle, and my parents playing the perfect hosts. My mother saw me first and came rushing over with this big fake smile, asking where I'd been. They'd been so worried about me. I looked so different. I kept it vague, said I'd been working a lot, things were good. She kept trying to dig for details about my job, and I just kept deflecting. Derek wandered over and immediately started with his usual condescending routine about how good it was to see me, asking if I was still doing that tech thing, saying he'd been meaning to call me back about that loan situation, but things had been crazy. I just smiled and said we could talk about it later. Here's where I need to explain something about my father that I didn't get into in my first post. Eugene isn't just normally successful. He's the kind of man who built his entire identity around being better than everyone else. His consulting business did well, sure, but he spent money like he was making twice what he actually made. The house, the country club membership, the cars, the private schools for us kids, all of it was about image, about being seen as the successful family. And when I dropped out of art school and couldn't get my life together, I wasn't just disappointing him, I was threatening that image. That's why he was so vicious at that retirement party 6 years ago. In his mind, I was the flaw in his perfect family portrait, the evidence that maybe he hadn't done everything right. So he cut me out of the narrative entirely and focused on Derek and Skylar, the two kids who fit his definition of success. But here's what I'd learned in my years working in tech. My father's business hadn't been doing as well as everyone thought. The consulting industry changed, younger firms undercut his prices, and he'd been coasting on reputation and old client relationships for the last decade. His retirement wasn't some triumphant victory lap. He got pushed out by market forces and lack of adaptability. And in the 6 years since, he'd been burning through his retirement savings trying to maintain the same lifestyle. I knew all this because I'd made it my business to know everything about my family's financial situation. Not through anything illegal, just through public records, social media stalking, and paying attention to the little things they let slip in conversation. Derek's bad investments weren't just bad luck. They were a pattern of him trying to replicate our father's success and failing. Skylar's apartment issues weren't building problems. She'd been living beyond her means and couldn't keep up with the rent increases in her trendy neighborhood. My family was basically broke and desperately trying to hide it from each other and everyone else. So I circulated around the party for about an hour, making small talk, letting people ask me questions and giving them non-answers. My aunt kept trying to corner me about what I did for a living, and I kept changing the subject. Some of my parents' friends were actually nice, asking genuine questions about my life, and I found myself almost liking a few of them. They had no idea what had happened 6 years ago. They just saw me as Eugene's middle son who'd been absent from family events. Around 8 p.m., my father stood up to make a speech. Everyone gathered in the living room with their drinks, and he launched into this long thing about family and legacy and how grateful he was for all the love and support over the years. He talked about how proud he was of his children, all three of them, and how we'd each found our own paths in life. I watched Derek and Skylar exchange this look, like they were trying not to laugh at the idea of Dad including me in the successful children category. Then my father said he wanted to introduce a special surprise for the evening. Derek was going to say a few words about the family and our father's influence on all of us. My brother stood up, looking pleased with himself, and started going on about how Dad taught us the value of hard work and discipline and excellence, how he'd shown us what it meant to be successful and respected in your community. I waited until Derek was really getting into it, talking about family values and supporting each other, and then I pulled out my phone. I'd spent the last month preparing for this moment. I'd edited that 12-minute recording down to the most damning parts, created a compilation that was about 4 minutes long of just the worst comments. I'd prepared a wireless speaker setup that I'd smuggled into the house earlier in the day, hidden in a gift bag I'd left in the coat closet, and I'd set everything up so all I had to do was press play on my phone. So that's what I did. The audio started playing through the speakers I'd hidden around the room. My father's voice filled the house saying, unlike my pathetic excuse of a son hiding outside somewhere, the family parasite who can't even hold a minimum wage job. Derek stopped talking mid-sentence. Everyone turned to look for where the sound was coming from. My brother's laugh came through next, crystal clear, saying I'd die alone in my filthy apartment begging for scraps. The room went completely silent except for the recording. My uncle's voice calling me a waste of oxygen and DNA. My aunt saying I was human garbage. Skylar calling me a loser living off handouts. And the sound of everyone applauding and toasting. I stood there in the middle of the room with my phone in my hand and I didn't say a word. Just let them all hear exactly what they'd said 6 years ago. The recording ended and nobody moved. My father's face had gone gray. My mother had her hand over her mouth. Derek was staring at me like he couldn't process what just happened. Skylar had tears in her eyes, but I don't know if they were from shame or anger. My father was the first one to speak. He started saying that was taken out of context. I didn't understand. Things were different back then. He was angry about some business issues and took it out on me unfairly. He started walking toward me with his hands up like he was approaching a dangerous animal, saying we could talk about this privately. There was no need to air family business in front of guests. I finally spoke up and asked him if he remembered that retirement party. If he remembered inviting me to discuss my situation and then locking me out of the backyard while he and everyone else mocked me. He started stuttering about how he'd been drinking. Everyone says things they don't mean. I was taking it too personally. Derek jumped in and tried to take control of the situation. He said I was clearly still hurt about some things from the past, but this wasn't the time or place to bring it up. We could all sit down as a family and work through it later. He actually tried to take my phone out of my hand, and I stepped back. That's when I told them I had copies of the recording saved in multiple places, and that every single person in this room was going to hear exactly how this family really felt about me when they thought I wasn't listening. My Aunt Edith started crying and saying she never meant those things. She was just going along with what everyone else was saying. She'd had too much wine. My uncle was trying to get everyone to calm down and suggested we all take a break and get some air. But the other guests weren't moving. They were all just standing there in shock, looking at my father and Derek and everyone else, and you could see them recalculating everything they thought they knew about this family. One of my father's old business partners, this guy named Walter, who'd known our family for decades, actually spoke up and said he'd always wondered why I was never around anymore. He'd asked my father about it a few times and been told I was just busy with my own life. He looked at my father and said he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. My father tried to smooth it over, saying family dynamics were complicated. There had been tension for years, everyone had made mistakes. He turned to me and said he was sorry, truly sorry, for the things he'd said that day. He asked if we could please discuss this in private and not ruin his birthday party. I asked him if he'd given me privacy when he mocked me in front of all these same people 6 years ago. If he'd thought about my feelings when he called me a parasite in front of his friends and family. That's when things really went off the rails. Update 2. You guys aren't going to believe what happened after that party. Actually, scratch that. Based on the comments I got on my last update, a lot of you predicted exactly how this would go down. So here's the full story of the aftermath, and trust me, it gets so much worse for them. After I asked my father that question about privacy, Derek completely lost it. He started yelling at me about how I was ruining everything, how I'd always been jealous of him and Skylar, how I couldn't stand that they were successful and I wasn't. He actually said I was pathetic for holding on to something from 6 years ago, that I needed to grow up and move on with my life. I just stood there and let him rant. And when he was done, I told everyone in the room exactly what I did for a living, what my position was, and roughly what I was worth financially. I didn't give them exact numbers, but I made it very clear that I was doing better than anyone in my family had ever done. The silence after that was intense. Derek's wife, Nova, actually laughed, like she thought I was lying. My uncle asked me to prove it, and I pulled up my investment portfolio on my phone and showed him the balance. Not all of it, just enough to make the point. His face went white. My father tried a different approach then. He got emotional, said he'd made mistakes. He'd been too hard on me. He wished he could take it all back. He talked about how stress from work had made him bitter, how he'd projected his own insecurities onto me, how he'd always loved me but didn't know how to show it when I was struggling. He asked if we could start over, build a better relationship now that I was doing well. I asked him if he would have apologized if I was still broke, if he would have felt sorry about what he said, if I'd shown up to this party in my old life, still struggling, still the failure he'd described. He didn't answer that. Skylar tried to play mediator. She said everyone had said hurtful things over the years. Families were complicated. We all needed to work on communication and forgiveness. She brought up how she'd asked to stay at my place and I'd turned her down. Said that hurt her feelings too. Maybe we all needed to examine how we treated each other. That's when I told her that I knew exactly why she needed a place to stay. That her fancy apartment in the expensive part of town was way beyond what she could actually afford on her salary. That she'd been struggling to keep up appearances just like Dad had been doing for years. I asked her if she wanted me to help her out financially or if she wanted me to pretend I didn't know she was barely making rent every month. She started crying and Oscar, her boyfriend, got defensive. He said I was being cruel. I was clearly getting some kind of sick satisfaction from humiliating my family in public. He told me I should be ashamed of myself for ambushing everyone like this at a birthday party. I pointed out that nobody seemed concerned about humiliating me at my father's retirement party 6 years ago. The guests were starting to leave at this point. Most of them were making quiet excuses and heading for the door. Nobody wanted to be part of whatever family drama was unfolding. Walter, my dad's old business partner, stopped on his way out and told my father he was disappointed in him. Said he'd always respected him, but this changed things. My father tried to explain, but Walter just left. My Aunt Edith cornered me in the hallway when I went to get my coat. She was full-on sobbing, mascara running down her face, saying she was so sorry. She'd been going through her own problems back then and took it out on me unfairly. She grabbed my arm and said I had to forgive her. I had to understand that people make mistakes when they're hurting. I pulled my arm away and told her that her pain 6 years ago didn't give her the right to call me human garbage. That sorry wasn't enough, that none of them would have cared about apologizing if I hadn't become successful enough to make them look bad. My uncle Raphael tried the aggressive approach instead. He got in my face and told me I was tearing the family apart over something petty, that I needed to be the bigger person and let this go, that holding grudges like this was toxic and unhealthy. He said my father was turning 70 for God's sake. Couldn't I show some compassion for an old man who made some mistakes? I reminded him that he'd called me a waste of oxygen and DNA in front of a crowd of people while they all laughed and applauded. I asked him if he thought that was compassionate. He backed off after that, but I could see he was furious. The party cleared out fast after that. Within 30 minutes, it was just family left. Me, my parents, Derek and Nova, Skylar and Oscar, and my aunt and uncle. My mother hadn't said a single word through any of this, just stood there looking like she wanted to disappear. Derek tried to take charge of the situation. He suggested we all sit down and have a calm, rational discussion about moving forward as a family. He pulled out chairs in the dining room and gestured for everyone to sit. I stayed standing. He started talking about family therapy, about how we clearly had communication issues that needed to be addressed with professional help. He said he understood I was angry, but I needed to channel that anger productively instead of lashing out. He offered to pay for family counseling sessions if that would help. I asked him if he had $5,000 for therapy, considering he'd asked me for $5,000 last month. His face went red, and Nova jumped in defending him, saying their financial situation was private and none of my business. I reminded her that my financial situation was apparently everyone's business 6 years ago, when they were all discussing what a failure I was. My father tried yet another approach. He said he would do anything to make this right. Anything I wanted, anything I needed from him, he would provide it. He asked me what it would take for me to forgive him and move past this. I told him I didn't want anything from him. I didn't need anything from him. That was the whole point. I'd built my life without any of their help or support, without their approval or encouragement. I'd done it specifically so I could stand here right now and show them that everything they said about me was wrong. Skylar asked what I wanted then, if not an apology or help or reconciliation. What was the point of playing that recording and humiliating everyone? I told her I wanted them to feel what I felt 6 years ago. Standing outside that fence, listening to my entire family tear me apart, hearing people who were supposed to love me celebrate the idea that I was worthless. I wanted them to know what it was like to have your worst moment exposed to everyone you know. My mother finally spoke up. She said she was sorry too, that she should have stopped them that day, that she'd failed me as a mother by not defending me. She was crying and shaking, and she looked genuinely devastated. She said she thought about that party all the time, that she regretted not speaking up, that she'd wanted to reach out to me so many times but didn't know how. I asked her why she didn't speak up then, why she just stood there with her wine glass and smiled while Dad called me a parasite. She said she didn't know. She'd been in shock. She'd frozen. She'd made the wrong choice. She begged me to let her try to be a better mother now. Part of me wanted to believe her. Part of me wanted to accept all their apologies and move on and have some kind of relationship with my family. But I'd spent 6 years imagining this moment. 6 years planning exactly what I would say and do. And I wasn't about to let 6 years of work go to waste because my mother cried. I told them I was leaving and I didn't want any of them to contact me. That I'd shown up to this party for one reason only, to make sure they all understood that I hadn't forgotten what they did, that their words had consequences, that you don't get to treat people like garbage and then act surprised when they stop being part of your life. Derek tried to physically block the door. He said we weren't done talking. I couldn't just drop a bomb like this and leave. We needed to work through this properly. He actually put his hands on my shoulders to keep me from leaving. I told him to move or I'd call the police and report him for assault. He moved. I drove home and spent the rest of the night going through messages. Derek sent me about 20 texts ranging from angry to pleading. Skylar sent me a long message about how I'd hurt her and damaged our relationship permanently. My aunt sent me religious quotes about forgiveness. My uncle sent me a message calling me ungrateful and disrespectful. My father sent me one message saying he loved me and he was sorry. My mother sent me a message asking if we could meet for breakfast tomorrow to talk. Just the two of us. I didn't respond to any of them. But here's where things get complicated, and this is why I need Reddit's advice. This morning, I got a message from Nova, Derek's wife. She asked if we could meet up privately because she had something important to tell me about Derek and my father. She said there were things I didn't know about why my family treated me the way they did. She said she'd kept quiet because she was trying to keep the peace, but after last night, she couldn't stay silent anymore. I have no idea what she's talking about. Part of me thinks this is some kind of setup, that Derek sent her to try to manipulate me or get information about what I'm planning to do next. But part of me is genuinely curious about what she has to say. And then, this afternoon, my father showed up at my house. Just appeared at my door unannounced. I watched him through the window for a few minutes, trying to decide whether to answer. He looked old and tired and defeated. Nothing like the confident, successful businessman who'd raised his glass and toasted to having 2 real children. He's still out there right now, standing at my gate. Every few minutes he knocks and calls my name, says he just wants to talk, says there are things I need to understand, says please. I don't know what to do here, Reddit. Do I hear him out? Do I meet with Nova? Or do I stick to my plan and cut them all off completely? Because honestly, I'm starting to realize that revenge isn't as satisfying as I thought it would be when you're actually living through it. Final update. All right, Reddit. This is going to be long because the last 48 hours have been absolutely insane, and I need to get all of this out. Some of you told me not to listen to Nova or let my father in. And honestly, you were probably right. But I did it anyway, and now I'm dealing with the fallout. I let my father inside that evening. He stood in my entryway looking around at my house like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Nice furniture, expensive electronics, artwork on the walls. All the markers of success he'd spent his whole life chasing. He kept touching things, running his hand along the back of my couch, staring at my kitchen counters like he was cataloging everything. He started by saying he knew I didn't want to hear excuses, but he needed to explain some things. He sat down without being invited and launched into this whole speech about how, when I was in my 20s and struggling, it terrified him. That, looking at me, was like looking at his own worst fears about failure and inadequacy. That his business was already declining and he was watching his legacy crumble, and having a son who couldn't hold a job felt like proof that he'd failed at everything that mattered. I told him that didn't excuse what he said at that party. That being scared didn't give him the right to humiliate me in front of everyone. He agreed. He said he knew that. But then he told me something I didn't know. That party wasn't just a retirement celebration. It was damage control. 3 of his biggest clients had dropped him that month. His business partner had told him they needed to dissolve the company. He was weeks away from declaring bankruptcy, and he'd invited all those people over to pretend everything was fine, to show them he was still on top, still successful, still the Eugene everyone respected. And I'd shown up as a reminder that he was losing control of everything. So he'd made me the villain of his story, the one failure he could point to and say, "At least I'm not that bad. At least I have Derek and Skylar." I asked him why he didn't just tell me he was struggling, why he couldn't admit he was having problems instead of tearing me down to make himself feel better. He said pride. Just pure, stupid pride. He said he'd built his entire identity around being the successful one, the provider, the man everyone looked up to. Admitting weakness felt impossible. Then he told me Derek knew. That Derek had known about the business failing and had been helping him hide it from the rest of the family. That some of Derek's bad investments weren't actually bad investments. They were loans to our father that Derek had disguised as investment losses so Nova wouldn't find out. That Derek had been financially supporting Dad for the past 3 years and was now in serious trouble himself because of it. I sat there processing this and realized it explained so much. Why Derek was always so aggressive about maintaining the family image. Why he'd been so angry at the party. He wasn't just defending Dad. He was defending his own financial decisions. He'd sunk a significant amount of money into keeping our father's lifestyle afloat, and now I'd exposed the whole house of cards. My father said Derek had asked him to talk to me about possibly helping them both out. Not a loan, exactly, but maybe some kind of family investment that could get them back on their feet. He was careful about how he phrased it, dancing around actually asking me for money, but that's what it was. I asked him if he was serious, if he actually thought I would give him money after everything that happened. He said he didn't expect it, but Derek was desperate and had asked him to try. Then he said something that actually surprised me. He told me he didn't think I should help them, that they'd made their choices and needed to live with the consequences. That he was telling me all this because I deserved to know the truth, not because he was trying to manipulate me into helping. He stood up to leave and turned back at the door. He said he was proud of what I'd accomplished, that he wished he'd said that 6 years ago instead of what he actually said, that he understood if I never wanted to see him again, but he hoped someday I might be willing to have a relationship with him, even if it was just occasional emails or phone calls. I didn't respond, and he left. The next morning, I met Nova at a park about 20 minutes from my house. She showed up looking stressed, kept checking her phone like she was worried Derek would find out she was meeting me. She told me she'd been wanting to talk to me for years, but Derek had forbidden it. He'd told her I was toxic and manipulative, and she needed to stay away from me for her own good. But after the party, after hearing that recording and seeing how everyone had treated me, she couldn't keep quiet anymore. She told me Derek had been obsessed with competing with me our entire lives. That even when I was at my lowest, broke and struggling, Derek saw me as a threat. Because our father had always praised my creativity, my intelligence, my potential, even while publicly tearing me down. She said Derek had convinced himself that Dad secretly preferred me and only criticized me because he was disappointed I wasn't living up to my potential. That all the mockery and cruelty was actually a twisted form of attention that Derek was jealous of. So Derek had encouraged it, amplified it, made sure everyone in the family knew I was the failure so he could be the success by comparison. She showed me text messages between Derek and our father from over the years. Messages where Derek would send updates about his promotions and achievements and ask Dad what he thought. Messages where Dad would respond positively but then mention something I'd done or could have done. Messages where Derek would get angry and defensive and start listing all my failures to remind Dad why I was the disappointment. It was pathetic and sad, and it made me understand my brother in a way I never had before. He wasn't just being cruel for no reason. He was desperately trying to be the favorite son and saw me as competition even when I had nothing. Nova said she was thinking about leaving him, that the financial pressure and his obsession with status and his treatment of me had made her realize she didn't actually like the man she'd married. She asked me not to tell Derek about our conversation because she needed time to figure out what she was doing. I spent the rest of that day thinking about everything I'd learned, about my father's fear and pride, about Derek's insecurity and jealousy, about how all of them had built their identities around being better than someone else instead of just being good people. Yesterday morning, the messages started flooding in again. Derek sent me a long text saying we needed to talk urgently, that there were family matters that required my attention. Skylar sent me a message saying she'd heard I met with Nova and asking what Nova had told me. My aunt sent me another round of Bible verses about forgiveness and family. My uncle sent me a message saying I needed to step up and help my father because that's what real men do. My mother sent me a message asking if I got the flowers she'd sent. I looked at my front door and there was a huge bouquet sitting there that I hadn't noticed. The card said she loved me and she was sorry and she hoped I could find it in my heart to let her back into my life. And then late yesterday afternoon, they all showed up. All of them. My parents, Derek and Nova, Skylar and Oscar, my aunt and uncle. They came to my house together like some kind of intervention group. I watched them through my window gathering at my gate, arguing with each other about who should knock first. My father finally knocked and called out that they needed to talk to me, that it was urgent, that it affected the whole family. Derek was pacing behind him, looking agitated. Skylar was crying. My mother was just standing there with her arms wrapped around herself. I went outside and stood on my porch. I didn't open the gate. I just looked at all of them standing there and asked what they wanted. Derek started talking about family responsibility and how we all needed to support each other in difficult times, how we'd had our disagreements, but now it was time to put that aside and focus on what really mattered. He said Dad was in serious financial trouble, and they were all struggling in various ways, and I was the only one who had the resources to help. I asked him if he was seriously standing at my gate asking me for money after everything that happened. He got defensive and said it wasn't about the money, it was about being there for family. That I'd made my point at the party, I'd humiliated everyone effectively, but now it was time to move past it and do the right thing. He said they'd all apologized, they'd all acknowledged their mistakes, and at some point I needed to accept that and move forward. Skylar jumped in saying she'd lost a major client because one of the guests at Dad's party knew someone at her firm and had mentioned the recording, that her professional reputation was being damaged because of what I'd done, that I'd gotten my revenge, but now I was hurting her career and that wasn't fair. My uncle said I was being selfish and childish. That family takes care of family regardless of past issues. That holding grudges like this was destroying everyone, and I needed to be the bigger person. My aunt said God would judge me for abandoning my family in their time of need. My mother said she knew I was angry, but she was begging me to please help them. That she understood I didn't owe them anything, but she was asking me as my mother to please not let them lose everything. I stood there listening to all of them, and I started laughing. I couldn't help it. The audacity of them showing up at my house demanding help after 6 years of treating me like garbage was just absurd. I told them no. Simple as that. No, I wouldn't help them financially. No, I wouldn't be there for family that hadn't been there for me. No, I wasn't responsible for fixing their problems or managing their reputations or saving them from the consequences of their own choices. Derek lost it completely. He started yelling about how I was destroying the family, how I was getting revenge by watching them all suffer, how I was no better than they were if I could just stand by and let them lose everything. He called me vindictive and cruel and said I'd turned into exactly the kind of person I claimed to hate. I told him he was right, that I was vindictive, that I had spent 6 years building my life specifically so I could have this moment where they needed me and I could say no, that every time I'd worked late or pushed through exhaustion or made a difficult decision, I'd been thinking about the day when they would come to me asking for help and I could turn them away. My father stepped forward and said he understood, that he deserved this, that they all deserved this. He told the others to leave, that they had no right to demand anything from me, that I'd given them my answer and they needed to respect it. Derek tried to argue, but my father actually raised his voice and told him to shut up and go home. They stood there for another few minutes in this awkward standoff. Nova was the first to leave, just turned and walked back to their car without a word. Skylar and Oscar followed. My aunt and uncle left together, my uncle shaking his head like I'd personally offended him. Derek stayed the longest, staring at me with this expression I couldn't quite read, anger and desperation and something that might have been respect. My parents were the last ones there. My mother tried one more time, asking if she could just come inside and talk to me privately. I told her there was nothing to talk about. She started crying harder, and my father put his arm around her and led her away. I went back inside and watched them all drive off. And you know what? I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt, no sadness. Just this weird, empty feeling where all that anger used to be. The This morning I woke up to about 40 missed messages. Derek sent me a series of texts saying I was making a huge mistake, that I'd regret this, that family was everything, and I was throwing it away over pride. Skylar sent me a message saying she hoped I was happy now that I'd destroyed everyone's lives. My aunt sent me a message saying she'd pray for my soul. My uncle sent me one last message calling me a disgrace to the family name. My father sent me a message saying he accepted my decision and wouldn't contact me again unless I reached out first. He said he'd make sure the others left me alone too. He said he loved me, and he was sorry, and he hoped I found peace. My mother sent me a message saying she'd always love me no matter what. If I ever changed my mind, she'd be there. I blocked all of them except my parents. I figured I'd leave that door open just in case, but I don't plan on walking through it anytime soon. So that's it, Reddit. 6 years of planning, 6 years of building myself up for this exact moment, and it's finally over. They came begging like I always imagined they would. They offered apologies and explanations and sob stories about how much they needed me, and I got to stand there and say no and watch them fall apart. I thought it would feel better than this. I thought I'd feel vindicated and powerful and satisfied, but mostly, I just feel tired. Tired of being angry, tired of carrying this around, tired of my family and their dysfunction and their endless need to compete and compare and tear each other down. I don't know if I did the right thing. Part of me wonders if I should have taken the high road, helped them out, been the bigger person everyone wanted me to be. But then I remember standing outside that fence 6 years ago listening to them laugh while my father called me a parasite. And I know I made the only choice I could live with. They wanted a family reunion. They got one. Just not the kind they were hoping for. I recorded my father's retirement party speech about what a pathetic failure I am, and now they've all learned what happens when you treat someone like garbage and expect them to forget it.